Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I am Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very glad to be back with everybody today. Please say hello in the chat box. We love to know who's with us, so let us know who you are and where you're coming in from. The chat is where you can also add your questions, and we will try to bring them in later in the conversation. And make sure you're chatting to everyone so we can all see you. A few words about JWA for anybody who is new to us. We are a digital archive that works to transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and full and nuanced story is going to help us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in this effort. The book talks are just one part of the work that JWA does. So please, at some point, check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. It's wonderful to see so many friends popping in to the chat. A quick logistical note: if anyone is looking for captioning, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen that says CC or Show Captions, and that will turn them on for you. Okay, I am delighted to introduce this evening's author. We are so glad to have with us Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zierler, who is the Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. She is the author of several books, including Movies in Midrash, Popular Film and Jewish Religious Conversation, and Rachel Stole the Idols, The Emergence of Hebrew Women's Writing, and the translator and co-editor with JWA's own Carol Balin, our beloved board chair, of To Tread on New Ground, Selected Hebrew Writings of Chava Shapiro. She is also the co-editor of These Truths We Hold, Judaism in an Age of Truthiness, and the co-editor of Proof Texts, a Jewish literary history, which is a scholarly journal in the field of Jewish literature. Tonight, we're going to be talking about her latest book, which is Going Out with Knots, My Two Kaddish Years with Hebrew Poetry, which was just published this past fall and which was just recently shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Award, which is super exciting. Wendy also comes with another hat on, which is that she received rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Maharat just a few years ago. So welcome, Wendy. We're so glad to have you here with us.
So excited to be with you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
This is a really beautiful book, and I hope that everyone who is with us will have a chance to look at it and to read it and to dip into it. It has so much different kinds of wisdom and text. It's a really unusual kind of book in that it combines memoir and poetry and translation and commentary. Um, Maybe you could start just by telling us a little bit about the origin of this project.
Thank you so much. So, unfortunately, the origin of this project is a series of familial tragedies. On March 12th of 2019, my beautiful father was making his way slowly from his car into a coffee shop to meet a friend when he was tragically hit by a distracted truck driver and immediately killed. Within that same year of my father's death, my mother passed away. So 5 days before what was supposed to be the end of the Kaddish for my father, we lost my mom. And exactly 6 weeks after that, a full year after my father's death, we were all plunged into the COVID experience, which basically subsumed any personal loss into that larger narrative that we were all going through world over. And one of the ways in which I coped with the succession of losses and tried to bring myself to the experience was that I took on, a few months into my Kaddish recitation, I took on the responsibility of giving a weekly class at the end of our morning minyan in Riverdale, where I live. But I wanted to do it my way, which is to say I wanted to bring some of my own expertise to the experience. And so I decided that instead of a conventional Dvar Torah, I would challenge myself to choose a different Hebrew poem and translate it and then teach it as a Dvar Torah. At first, into issues of prayer and mourning, so that it would be in conversation with the experience. And then it went on and on, so it became a number of things. This has been going on now for 6.5 years where I do this every Tuesday teaching. Unfortunately, my father was killed on a Tuesday, and we have a succession of familial tragedies that occurred on Tuesday. And yet, Tuesday is supposed to be this especially blessed day because of the creation story where God said it was, good twice on Tuesdays. And so I was trying to bring back some of the good of Tuesday by engaging in this creative, intellectual, spiritual way with the material that I engage with academically.
Mm-hmm.
And so the book became this interesting hybrid of interweaving the experience of mourning, which morphed into different things along the way, interweaving that with these weekly poem teachings and walking with these poets through the experience.
One of the things that felt so aligned with JWA's own work in reading this is how you were using these poems, which in many of them are written by women, to expand the canon, to include new voices and perspectives. And um, I very much resonated with that experience that I think some of us have had with Kaddish, which is that you are suddenly spending more time maybe than usual with um, liturgy on a daily basis that maybe we aren't always confronted with on a daily basis, some of us at least, and sort of slamming up against that sense of like, where am I exactly here? How do I find myself in this text?
Yeah, well, death is the ultimate defamiliarizer of our lives, and being in synagogue like that twice a day, every day, for me it was 22 months straight,
Hmm.
does put you on a collision course with traditional liturgy if that's where you find yourself. And suddenly you're paying attention to the words. It doesn't help if you really understand the words.
Yes, I've often felt that way. It's a mixed blessing.
If you really understand them, then you're suddenly hurled into this theological crisis. And it struck me very painfully early on in the experience that the traditional Siddur does not include a single prayer written by a woman. Last week, we read Parshat Beshalach, which includes Miriam's song, and yet in the traditional Siddur, the Song of the Sea, which is recited every single day, that last bit where Miriam takes the timbrel is lopped off. So, I had to scrawl in those verses into my Siddur that I brought with me to synagogue every day to compensate. And so when I was choosing poets, I was very eager to expand the canon and to, in a sense, create a supplementary Siddur where the people I was praying with at the end of Tefillah were going to be praying a little bit from a different book.
Hmm. One of the other things I thought was interesting is in the introduction, you sort of talk about, that there is a tr there are many books that have been written about the Kaddish experience, but really not from the perspective of a woman saying Kaddish. And I was thinking about this sort of long history of struggle of women saying Kaddish or trying to say Kaddish, going back. I'm sure it goes way before this, but I was thinking about Henrietta Zold, who in 1916, when a family friend offered to say Kaddish on her behalf for her mother, insisted, in fact, that she was going to say Kaddish herself, even though that wasn't the tradition at the time. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg also had an experience of wanting to say Kaddish and not having access to do that. And Letty Cotton Pogrebin had a experience when she lost her mother as a child of wanting to say Kaddish and not being able to. And I was curious if you, first of all, were aware of some of those stories and if you saw yourself sort of in that lineage as well.
Thank you so much for asking that. Yes, very much so. One of the writers that I have written about, a prose writer, Zvora Baron, wrote a story in the early 20th century called Kadisha,
Mm,
about her struggle to be able to say Kaddish for her grandfather and the scandal that occasioned. Yes, I'm very aware of those, and I'm also aware of the privilege to have been born at a time where even within the Orthodox community, at least in a certain subset of Orthodox synagogues, I could say Kaddish, though I talk about some of the challenges that I faced in my parents' home congregation. I'm aware of that privilege, and so I'm also consciously aware of of how in some instances the things that I spoke about seem as though I'm complaining about this right that was so hard fought. What I mean by that is that I reported on how it was difficult for me to have men insist that they layer their voices over mine in order for that to be acceptable, or the experience of coming to synagogue on a few occasions in an Orthodox setting where I was there on time and we had to wait for a minyan. And I did manage to wrestle out a commitment on the part of our synagogue rabbi that when that happened, an apology would be issued
Hmm.
to women, that we had not yet reached the redeemed state that we ought to find to find the will and the halachic way to truly treat women as
Hmm. I love
equal.
that. There was a piece I think towards the end of the book also where you sort of reflect on, after so many months of bringing these texts and changing, basically creating, as you said, this kind of new liturgy for your whole community to be delving into. You sort of ask, like, if that's not counting, what is? And so I think that question also of like what it means to count and how we show up in our communities and what things we get hung up on sometimes for very good reasons, and also what sometimes I think we um how much we have to always be expanding our sense of what these words mean. I think we have a request to have
Yeah,
your
I've been
sound a
told
little
that
bit louder. I'm
yeah,
not sure if
my
that's
micro my
something that I can
microphone.
control either.
I'm speaking as loud as I can, but I'll try to speak even louder.
Okay, thank you. So the title of the book, Going Out with Knots, uh is not one that is immediately clear what that means to someone who doesn't know the specific text that it is referring to. So can you tell us a little bit about the title and the text that it comes from?
Yeah, thanks. So that title comes from an experience that I had early on in my mourning experience that predates the poem teachings. In fact, it's from an experience that I had during the Shloshim, the first 30 days after my father's passing. And I had taken on the obligation, the commitment with other members of my family to study Mishnah in honor of my father. We do that. It's customary to study Mishnah because the Mishnah, that first layer of the Talmud, shares the same Hebrew letters as the Hebrew word neshama for soul. So it's thought that one elevates the soul through the study of Mishnah. And I had taken on to study Tractate Shabbat because my father had made a big sacrifice in his life, giving up a family business so that my family could move to Toronto so that he could stop working on Shabbat and he and his children could go to Jewish day school. And so I thought, what a better, what could be a better tribute than to study Tractate Shabbat. Uh, I was back home visiting my mom 2 weeks or so after my father's death, and my mom had given me my father's talit to pray with that morning. And that morning, when I was at my parents' synagogue at Minyan, the Mishnah that I studied from the sixth chapter of Tractate Shabbat, which discusses questions of what you're allowed to carry from a private domain to a public domain, that is considered clothing and not an extra accessory, not like hauling wood or so on,
Right.
like something. So the Mishnah says, Habanim yotzim biksharim, that sons go out with knots, that you can wear knots, and that won't be considered carrying. And the rabbis ask, what are these knots? At first, they consider the possibility that maybe these knots are medicinal. There's some kind of aromatherapy or, knot that you have that will cure you of some ailment. But then they say, well, why then sons and not daughters? Why younger people and not older people? And then they alight upon this explanation that a son who is missing his father, they take a strap from the father's right shoe and tie it either to the boy's left arm or left shoe. And so long as that knot is on the boy's person, then his longings depart from him.
Hmm.
as if talismanically, like an amulet. And then, well, that morning, what I studied in terms of the commentary was the commentary of the Bartanura, the 15th century Mishnah commentator, who said, and that's why the Mishnah speaks and teaches only about sons, because daughters don't have the same longings for their father as sons do. So there I was. I mean, it was in synagogue, lamenting my father's death, whom I was very, very close to, wrapped in his ritual knots, engaging in this study so as to remain tied and connected to him and honoring him in this way. And yet the text is as if saying I don't exist. My feelings don't exist. And I felt as though the text was punching me in the face. And I literally hollered out like, "What?"
Mm,
And it became clear to me that I was going to have to find a way to, an alternate creative way if I wanted to remain tied to the tradition and not have this experience fray my connection, but strengthen it, that I was going to have to lean into some sort of creative supplement, that as much as I am committed to be connected to traditional texts, that I was going to have to also bring my modernity and my feminism very much to this experience.
hmm.
And so the going out with knots is a colleague of mine said, you don't want to be going out with NOTSs, but with to remain knotted. So throughout it and not be in knots.
Right. Right. That's what I was thinking about, just sort of like how knotted up you can feel when you feel unresolved or angry about something. And that merging of the grief of personal loss with the grief of exclusion or feeling like your own experience is being erased. Um, but also the way that in some ways it became like an invitation for you to fill um, this lack in the text, right? This place in the text where you can so easily see uh, the rabbis missing something, like just not understanding what is possible between a father and a daughter.
Well, I was given a number of apologetic explanations. Of course, this was a different time. Men and sons were more bound together. Daughters and mothers were more bound together. And I hear all of that. But once we get involved in that historicizing, then one would want people to be open to the implications of that historicizing. So what's interesting is that the Mishnah itself includes some of the seed. At the end of that Mishnah, um, there's this addendum. The Mishnah says that sons can go out with knots and princes can go out with bells on. Bells were signifying their aristocratic station. And
Hmm.
then it says, V'chol Adam, and any person actually can go out, presumably wearing bells if that's the fashion. But rather, the sages, Dibru Chachamim Behoveh, the sages spoke in the present day language. And I realized with the help of one of my teachers that I could actually use that in relation to the first part of the Mishnah too. That the Mishnah was speaking in the parlance of it, the gender segregated parlance of its time, but that in their hoveh, but that we need to speak in our hoveh. And so bringing in this modern poetry was one way to accomplish that.
Hmm. I loved that also as you explored different poets, you were both, I mean, to maybe overuse the metaphor, sort of creating these knots of um, tying some of those modern poems as also responses to the text, and finding reflection of your own experience there. So in other words, like both doing that interpretive work of connecting them, but also discovering that in fact you were not alone in having some of these responses to these texts. And in fact, there were writers who had come before you who had noticed some of these same things and had responses to them. Um, are there any ones that you would particularly want to share in that vein?
Yes, well, if coming on the heels of what we talked about just a second ago, the going out with knots theme, I was delighted and encouraged and consoled to discover that one of the poets that I had been teaching late in the cycle, who was also a colleague of mine at HUC and a teacher of mine while I was studying at Maharat, Ruchama Weiss, a contemporary Israeli poet, the only living poet in the book. And I'm so delighted because this is the first time that her work is really appearing in translation in this kind of way, that she had written a poem specifically about this going out with knots issue. Um, Not about the Mishnah, actually about the Talmudic, the discussion in the Babylonian Talmud 66 B about this, and Rashi's commentary on this. I'll just quote Rashi's commentary and then if it's okay with you, I can read the poem and
Yeah, I
then.
would love that.
So the poem that she wrote was called Lament for Rashi's Daughters, Kina al Benot Rashi. And at the beginning of the poem, she quotes Rashi's commentary on this, on the word ga'aguim, which is longings. It's an amazing onomata poetic word, ga'aguim. It sounds like gaga, but it also sounds like a repeated syllable longing, right?
Mm,
And so Rashi glosses that gaguim are barmut, like a paramur, like an extra love, an excessive love, that the son loves his father so much and can't separate from him. And then he says that this remedy, refuah, is not relevant for nikevot, for females, she'ena av mechavevan kol kach, that a father never shows that much love to his daughter mitrilatan, from their inception.
mm,
Sheyu megagerim alav, that they should ever come to love, to miss him, to long for him. And what Ruchama imagines is, if what we know about Rashi's daughters, or what we are told about Rashi's daughters, is true, that they served as their father's scribes, amanuenses, then is it possible that they actually read this commentary and had to copy that down and
mm.
internalize that? So I'll read the poem, and then if you have questions, I can answer. How they sat, Miriam, Yocheved, and yet another daughter left without a name. That's what we learned in girls' school. Night after night, they sat after the last student left. They poured hot drinks for father, caressed his words, wrote down his commentaries. On their last legs, with yawning eyes, they wrote with love, with longing, this last commentary too. And he doesn't miss them and has no extra love. He has no remedy of relevance to females. It was decreed that they should write and wait with heavy hands and unrequited longing. They should wait for him finally to show them fondness. One day, perhaps, he will long for them or hear their longings with the coming of his grandsons, Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam. Their merit should protect us.
Thank you. I had grown up with that story of Rashi's daughters being his scribes and also the idea that they had actually worn tefillin. So in my mind, Rashi was like this feminist dad who had like included his daughters and opened them up to all these opportunities that other women at the time didn't have. So I was very like heartbroken to hear this, but also to imagine them sort of doubling down on there was some, it made me think about how differently people can respond to different experiences, right? You could imagine that experience of being like, well, forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. Or you don't understand, or I'm not included, so I want no part of this. Or this other response of like, I'm going to prove something to you by, you know, doubling down on my commitment despite whatever lack you are not understanding. Um,
They become this model, I think, in that much more textured, nuanced, and psychologically complex way of people who manage to reconcile or live with contradictions.
yeah.
Uh, if you love a tradition, you're just like if you love a family member, you're aware of their frailties and their faults, and you have a choice. I mean, if
Hmm.
it's so incredibly toxic that you can leave, um, or you can find a way to stay and persevere, knowing, like thinking about incremental change.
Right.
In this case, the requiting of the love comes, in through the sons that they managed to bring to Rashi. Rashi didn't have any sons, so these illustrious grandchildren who become his primary interlocutors. the Rabbeinu Tam, Jacob Tam, and Rabbi Solomon ben Meir, the first layer of the Tosafists. And I wondered in my commentary whether perhaps some of the moms' disappointment at their gaguim that were not entirely requited the way they wanted them to be, whether the sons might have internalized that, and whether one could read into some of the vociferous debates that unfolded, especially between Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi. Sometimes it got hard. In my
Right.
rabbinical studies, I was noting like, whoa, he's going hard on Rashi, and what's behind that? And so I wondered whether they had internalized some of the insult of their moms. That might be a highly anachronistic, fictionalized imposition on the text, and yet it rang true to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and it speaks to the fact that every generation is going to take things in their own direction and make change. And again, it may not be as directly in response to the previous generation's dynamics as we might, we don't know how that work plays out. But the sense that those changes happen from generation to generation, no matter what, and to be able to see that play out in ancient, not, I guess not ancient exactly, but texts from hundreds of years ago, and to recognize that those dynamics are still alive within us as we are also doing this work of responding to text and engaging with it and interpreting and adding new voices.
Yeah, absolutely. I, this is a book because it was written with a strong subject position. I was allowed to bring my eye
Hmm.
into this, and not keep myself at a remove. It was important for me to be able to find myself in these texts. And so the idea that I might have kindred spirits and people who were accepting less than perfect feminist outcomes, with the long longing kept alive, right? That you stick with it in the hope of being able to bring the incremental change that can stick, that can persist
Hmm.
and not generate a backlash. I mean, it agonizes me every day, the kind of backlash that we're seeing unfold with such a vengeance now. So how can we affect changes that stick?
And one of the themes that comes out very strongly in the book is that you are engaging in these traditional practices, but because it is you doing it, there is something new and, you know, you're both uh I can't think of the right word. Sorry, my brain is not functioning. You're both kind of replicating rituals that have existed for forever, but because it is you doing it, it is necessarily something new. So, for example, wearing your father's talit or tefillin is an act that, taking a parent's talis or tefillin is something that has been passed on for generations, for forever. And then also it is new because it is you doing it. Um, One of the poems that you write about in the book and that you translate is a beautiful Yehuda Amichai poem about a talit. And that sense of power of ritual and ritual objects and the memories that inhere in them. Um, that one spoke to me very personally because I actually wear my mother's talit also. It was one of the things that I took from her when she died. And it is it, without fail when I wrap myself in it, that moment when I put it over my head to say the blessing, I feel her presence. And it is the only time really that I feel her presence. I don't feel her presence at the grave. Um, but it is so amazing and so intense. And I keep expecting it. My mother died 14 years ago. I keep expecting that it's going to fade. I've actually have become a little bit afraid of washing my talit for this reason, which I know sounds crazy. Um, because I don't actually think she's in the fibers, but it hasn't. And it's like those incredible things that happen in just the wave of a piece of fabric around you and the tent that you've seen someone do for so long, it brings something back.
I feel very blessed to be able to have my father's talit, and I took on the new obligation to lay tefillin every day. Actually, during the Shiva for my mom,
Mm,
I felt that I needed something to mark that it wasn't just days of Kaddish, melding into other days of Kaddish. And my son, whose name is Amichai, with Yuda Amichai in mind, because Yuda Amichai played a very influential role in my life, my son taught me how to lay tefillin.
Mm, it's
And
amazing.
in donning these accoutrements, I feel on the one hand that I am maintaining a tradition, a long-standing tradition, but I'm entirely disrupting a tradition because no woman in my family and none of the women in the community that I grew up in lay tefillin or wear a talit. I remember what early on when I started wearing a talit, asking my mom, "Can I?" And I couldn't even get the question out before she said no. I was about to say, "Can I bring my talis to shul?"
Hmm.
And it was such a beautiful growth moment when she actually offered me my father's talit after
Yeah.
he passed. But I was aware of that, the way in which I was severing a knot in attaching myself to this tradition. And yet it is so visceral and meaningful. The particular Yuda Amichai poem that you're referencing, and I'm happy to read it,
Yeah, I would love for you to read it.
I taught this poem the week after the Kaddish for my mother ended.
Mm.
And I was facing the whole crisis after 22 months straight of saying Kaddish 3 times, not 3 times a day, like at three tefillot um, each day. It comes out to about 8 different Kaddishes over the course of a regular day. Um, I was wondering how I would ever bring myself not to say those words.
Yeah.
It's entirely autopilot at that point, and being able to recite Kaddish is such a powerful tether to your loved one, to your lost one. And so it would be breaking a knot, severing the thread. And so I taught this poem because it was about carrying over a childhood experience into adulthood and the way in which experiences transmute over the course of one's life, and yet where one affects a continuity in the face of a disruption. So I'll read the poem and then we can talk more about it.
Yeah.
Whoever was wrapped in a talit in youth will never forget taking it out of the soft velvet bag, opening the folded talit, spreading it out, kissing the length of the neckband, some neckbands embroidered, others trimmed in gold. After that, with a great unfurling overhead, like a sky, a wedding canopy, a parachute, and then winding it around your head as if playing hide and seek, and then wrapping your whole body in it so close, tucking into it like the cocoon of a butterfly, then opening up as if with wings to fly. And why is the talit striped and not checkered, black and white like a chessboard? Because squares are finite and hopeless. Stripes come from endlessness and go to endlessness like runways in an airport where angels land and take off. Whoever is wrapped in a talit will never forget when you climb out of the swimming pool or the sea. You wrap in a large towel, spread it out again over your head, and again tuck into it so close and still shiver a bit and laugh and bless.
Mm, thank you.
So, what really moves me about this poem, I mean, there are many things, but part of it is the way in which he uses metaphor and simile, which are figures of speech, where you take disparate elements and you yoke them in a resemblance. So one can argue that childhood and adulthood are different things that are being yoked in a resemblance. Um, that's the genius of metaphor, which one can argue is the building block of poetry, that it allows you to take one experience and shed light on it in with the help of another object, another experience, and refract that light, and suddenly you see something anew. And so metaphor is this thing that's aware of the differences between things and yet insists very stubbornly in bringing them together. And so here he brings together such disparate fields, religion and the beach, sky and ground, physics and mysticism, a talus and a runway, aeronautics and the synagogue. Uh,
Runway for an Angel.
runway, yes. So utter secularism and like the most uh, dogged type of religiosity, and insists that you can construct, that you can tie a thread between these things. And of course, the image of going to the beach as a type of going to a synagogue, right? Because what do Israelis do on Shabbat if they're secular? Like it's a holy pastime to go to the beach.
Right.
What did parents do with their children after they get out of a pool is wrap them so tightly. So there is that in your own wrapping of yourself out of coming out of the beach as an adult, there's this evocation of being wrapped by a child. And so each of these things are layered. And for me, they allowed that entry into the next phase of disconnectedness, which was post Kaddish, to be helped along by this sense of being able to construct, through an operation of the imagination, a connection to the past,
Hmm.
so that I could feel it. I could feel it even though I was no longer going to be saying the words.
I was thinking also about Yehud Amichai as somebody who grew up religious and became secular and left those particular practices behind, but obviously not really. They lived with him in other forms. And then in your case, you were taking on things that you hadn't done previously. And sort of there was this kind of meeting place in some way of what it means to step away from something and have those acts mean, appear in other forms, and then what it means to step into a practice that you've seen but haven't enacted, bodily yourself.
Yeah, I can't actually say whoever was wrapped in a talit in youth. I can't relate to that.
Right.
It's a leap of the imagination for me. I watched the boys, or I watched people on the other side do it. And so I was likening myself to him through, adopting this poem on some level, on a personal level. But I love the fact Yud Amichai, I feel, has been a partner, an unknowing, unwitting partner with me in a lifetime effort to try and blur the boundary between what is religious and
Mm,
what is secular. Uh, I believe that a sharp line is a false sharp line, especially when one talks about Hebrew literature. Even the most insistently secular poems, in being written in Hebrew and often almost reflexively alluding to classical sources, they aren't untethered from a religious impulse. And in fact, often these were former yeshiva bachurim who were retooling, channeling their religious energies toward the kibbutz work or some other form of devotion to Eretz Israel. So this seems another great example to add to the toolkit of like an ongoing effort to bring people together rather than divide them around purported division, dividing lines, religious, secular, right, left, male,
right.
female.
One of the other things that you mentioned, I think, in your discussion of this poem in the book is the ways in which it speaks to translation. He's talking about translating a particular ritual act into other kinds of experiences. But you, of course, are engaging with all of these Hebrew texts and then translating them into English. Can you talk a little bit about that, what translation meant to you in this process and how you went about it?
Yeah,
Had you
thank
done a lot of translating of poetry, of Hebrew poetry before?
I've been translating since forever. My first book, "And Rachel Stole the Idols," includes translations of all the poems and the poets and the prose writers that I was introducing. I feel that translation is a very useful beginning step in entering into the text. It requires an attentiveness to both the literal meaning and also to the way in which one needs to finesse um, the words to be able to get a sense of the form or get some sense of the meaning beyond the literal. So I like that as a first step. I was also aware of translation as, like metaphor, as an act of carrying over meaning from one place to another. I mean,
Mhm.
my book insists, I mean, all the poems are also brought in Hebrew, and I care very much that we have an opportunity to interact with the original text. But I'm also aware that, it's a human project for us to understand one another. And languages separate us. And so translation is this tremendous act of faith in our ability to understand one another and to carry meaning over from one place to another. And I was eager to carry meaning over from myself and my private experiences to the collective. I was, after all, teaching this with other people in a tradition that actually insists that mourners in their private grief join with others.
Mm.
So translation is a way of, it's just a language figure, a language operation that is about us trying to figure out a way to take something that means something to one person and bring it over to someone else and transport it. And so that act, it in some cases provoked conversation and quibbling. People, when I would teach the poem, say, "What about that? Like, are you sure about that? I might have translated it this way." So that became a way of being able to engage in study. And for me, it became a way of being able to open up the elusive, the illusions in the texts, um, to prove and to show the way in which these texts can be seen as another layer of commentary on our classical sources, insofar as in the translations I was insisting on bringing the various references and engaging with them and thinking about how they rewrote the original materials. So I'm also eager to try and affect some sort of union between Israel and the diaspora, between the Zionist project and where we are today, um, in our various forms of relationship with Zionism, and see the way in which we can, through access to these texts, recover joy, enthusiasm, marvel, wonder over the successes and the glories of the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language and as a flourishing culture since the inception of Zionism.
Yeah, that is actually my touchstone for hope for anything about Israel. When someone says like, is it possible to X, Y, or Z? I'm like, imagine what you would have said if the people who revived Hebrew came to you and said, I have this plan to make Hebrew a modern spoken language. It would have been like, well, that's absurd and never going to happen. And here we are. And if that can be done, then anything is possible. Anything could be built or changed.
I truly believe that, and I get a great charge at participating, bringing Americans, Canadians, people from around the world closer to the wonder of that project and the role that women played in that experience. I'm often greeted with shock when I drop the bomb on audiences and say that after the closing of the canon, the biblical canon, there isn't a single, well, there are individual poems that are written by women after the closing of the canon, but there is not a single book published in the Hebrew language by a woman until the end of the 19th century. And the first book of poetry ever published by a woman is not till the end of the 19th century, and that's by Rachel Lutzat Morpurgo, who is featured in my book.
And that was going to be my next question because we actually have a question in the chat about how you located her. She is the writer that goes back the earliest um, in the book, and she was from Trieste and has this incredible story. So tell us a little bit about her
Uh,
work and how you
hmm.
came
I
across it.
happened upon her when I was doing my doctoral research. My first book is called "And Rachel Stole the Idols: The Emergence of Modern Hebrew Women's Writing." And I was eager, having been a student of the American and British female literary traditions. I was eager to see what we had in the Hebraic tradition. And I would often joke to myself that Virginia Woolf groused about the fact that she had no precursor figures, and she had to invent the figure of Judith Shakespeare in order to imagine a woman living in the Elizabethan period. But and yet she had all of these predecessor figures. She had the Brontes, and Bradstreet in the United States, very successful women novelists. And yet we had nothing. We did not have a single book. And so I was interested in exploring that. And one of the deans of Hebrew letters at Hebrew University, Professor Dan Miron, had written a book about about this on this subject, in which he glancingly referred to Rachel Luzzata Morpurgo as a kind of Enlightenment rhymester who wrote rather insignificant occasional verse. And then
Mm. It's always those
when I
little
dug out a
asides
bit,
that are the gems that we get to
yes,
polish and pick up on.
yes, and that she really never took herself seriously. You know, she was basically writing Gramim or limericks for people's weddings, that
Mm.
kind. And yet, one of the poems that I include in my book is an occasional poem that she wrote for a cousin of hers, also named Rachel, uh, and it's a pretty serious, important poem. In fact, it's the first poem that we have that a woman wrote to another woman, and in fact, that a female authored sonnet, exquisitely rhymed, written in this loving, admiring way by a woman to another woman, you know, not about fighting over a man or some other typical theme that we're used to seeing in the Hebrew literary tradition, is remarkable. And I wondered whether it could be included as a wedding poem, something that could be recited at weddings. And so it was really, you know, credit to Dan Miron for opening that door for me. But often when women are denigrated, that's when we get to dig into the story and retell it.
Would you like to read that one for us as well?
Would love to. So that is a poem that it has the epigraph, and this poem is for the aforementioned bride upon her leaving Trieste to join her groom in Padua. I'll note, so Rachel Luzzata Morpurgo lived in Trieste. Her first cousin was a man named Shmuel David Luzzato, who was actually her first study partner, her first chavruta, and he was a teacher at the yeshiva in Padua. And she has another poem in which that I included in the book, where she expresses regret about not being able to be with her relatives for Passover in Padua. So clearly, the distance was not insignificant between Trieste and Padua, and so this this Rachel is greeting and facing the possibility of really missing the other Rachel, and it matters that they have the same name and that name they share with the biblical Rachel.
Right.
Is it okay if I read it in Hebrew also?
Yeah.
Because the Hebrew really matters in this case, and you'll hear why. So the epigraph after that title, Lizot Yikare Hefziba, this one shall be called My Delight is with her. And that is a quotation from Isaiah that typically is associated, you know, God referring to us as as God's delight. So it's very different to have a woman speak of another woman as her delight. Rachel im Rachel niksheret, ke'anak alei gargeret. אהבתך לי תפארת, על ראשי הנך כותרת. טוב טעמך מכל פרפרת לי ינעם, אך את סותרת החברה להיות נבחרת מסולם אל עיר אחרת. שירה זאת הינה מזכרת, אהבה להיות נהדרת, הומיה אני שוררת. יום אל יום אשמע איגרת דברי שלום, גם אוגרת לשלומו רחל עטרת. Rachel and Rachel are connected like a necklace to a neck. Your love is my laurel, on my head a crowning glory. To me, your wisdom is prized above all desert, but you're leaving our small cohort to be lifted tall on a ladder in another capital. This poem is a memento of love now absent. Longingly I chant. Daily shall I send mail, bearing greetings to regale Solomon and his jewel Rachel.
Mm. Nice.
So I tried wherever I could to be able to insert the rhyme, paying attention to what Morpurgo pulled off in this poem. It's a sonnet. Sonnets, Italian sonnets typically have a set rhyme scheme. It's not a like this. This poem stubbornly insists on that eret, 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 eret ending, which of course reminds us of Gveret, like a very feminine ending of Mrs. But I like to believe that its meaning, in this case, form is producing meaning. And what it is producing is a sense of constancy. It's a mantra like chanting of the same sound so as to conjure up constancy or continuity in the face of the disruption, which is going to be her move away from the close clutch of their relationship. Here Rachel is going to be marrying this guy, Solomon Sulam. Sulam was a pretty eminent family. There was an important woman in scholar, Italian woman named Sara Copia Sulam.
Mm.
So an important family, and so she's being lifted up as if on the ladder of this marriage. But the
The
marriage is,
sulam means ladder. I don't think you said that. Right.
yes. Hence, you're being lifted tall on a ladder in another capital. So she's recognizing that this is a very auspicious occasion for her cousin, but that it's sad and it's a break of some sort. And so she is imagining also how what can keep it going? Well, writing. And so day after day, I'm going to listen up for an egeret, for a letter.
Mm.
The word igeret is such a fabulous word because it's a letter, and women were able to enter into literary traditions through letter writing. But we also know that insofar as we had women participating in Hebrew literary traditions before, going way back to the Bible, it was through the igeret. So there are only two women who are the subject of the verb to write in the Bible. One is Izebel, Jezebel, which suggests something of
Yeah,
a
the power
negative.
and danger of the written word.
But the other example is Esther. Esther,
Mm.
and Esther wrote Vatichtov Sfarim. She wrote books, so to speak, but they also sent out letters, igrot, and so it links all the way back to that too. And there was an important responsa literature that took on the moniker of, igrot, igeret haramban, and so on. So it's a multivalent marker of a women's tradition on the one hand, but also trying to get connected and to gain entrance into the male tradition too.
And it's also another form of connection of nodding of women to one another, which again is not something that is recognized as or valued or even recognized as something that is meaningful in traditional text necessarily. I mean, maybe between mothers and daughters a little bit, but certainly not woman to woman.
I, whenever one becomes a student of our classical sources, one becomes painfully aware of the lacuna in our tradition. What is being represented, what isn't being represented, and what it is that we have to add. I mean, part of the reason why I've been committed over the years to teaching these early Hebrew women writers and to follow them into the contemporary moment is it has to matter if after so many centuries, women have finally entered into the tradition. It has to be that we're saying something different. Not in every instance. I don't want to essentialize us and anticipate that a woman is going to speak in a particular way. And messianic times will find that perhaps a man will write like a woman, but to track those moments where certain silences are suddenly filled with sound in a different
Mhm.
way.
And so much of what you're writing about really throughout the book is the power that poetry has as a form of prayer, as a source of healing, as a way to connect, as a way to bring yourself through a particular experience or moment. Um, I'm not sure what my question is there, but I guess that sense that there is maybe not messianic, but something powerful and possible comes out of these expressions and these attempts to both reckon with other sources, to bring our own lives in as a source unto itself.
So yes. And I think what your question is there is why poetry in particular. I
Mm,
mean, there are many forms of literary expression and why poetry. And I think part of it is a recognition that poetry, unlike prose, everyday language, the way we regularly speak, poetry is um, a very carefully arranged, considered, concentrated, compact form of expression that is meant in some cases to look at things slant, not directly.
hmm
Sometimes you stare at the thing directly and you hit against a wall, and so the refraction of it is useful. It is the sort of text that requires you to pause and to think about very carefully, and to accord it that sort of mysterious, like maybe initial incomprehension. Um, in times of grief, a few different things happen. First of all, we lose language. We don't know. We sob. And so poetry is that. Reading poetry is a way of reclaiming language and its possibilities. It acknowledges the fact that death is a mystery that we cannot parse or uncover its meaning ever. It will always remain mysterious for us. And so that genre for me felt more relevant. And it often is coming from, I don't want to say, I mean, there are some poems that are about joy. There's a Leah Goldberg poem, Nisayon, which I taught, but it's not included in the book, which is, how will I ever bear this simcha kazot, bracha kazot? How will I ever carry such joy? But and that's its own gorgeous question, as if joy is a burden. But many poems start with pain. And so the last poem that I close with in the book by Amir Gilboa is called Kadur min Hatsar. Uh, this Kadur out of pain. And the reason why I haven't translated it yet is because it can be translated in three different ways. A Kadur can be a bounce ball, a round ball, or it can be a bullet, or it can be a pill. And it's a poem about poetry that you start with. It's this tsar, this pain. And, the poet says, Hine e'eseh kadur minatzar, behold, I will make a ball out of this pain. And we know that poetry, like carefully considered language, poems have actually been weapons. Even in the most recent war, there were songs that were sent out into the world to shore up a certain kind of resolve, um, to go out to war. And the 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 pain can also be transmuted into a form of healing as a poem, but also a form of play and joy that's bounced around and thrown between people, and that it requires participation, a collective, to affect that transmutation. And he talks about through this in the poem. He talks about through this, I'll open shar achar shar, the rhyme of with tsar. I'll open gate after gate. And the gate, of course, the gates can be the gates of prayer. They can be the gates of a synagogue. Think about all the shuls that are called Sharei Shamayim or Sharei Tfilah.
Right.
But the word shar also means the cover or the frontispiece of a book. so that I will write this poem and it will open up a whole library for you. So poems it's crazy. And it seems like a naive, nutty thing, like super nutball thing to say that a poem could do anything in the world. You know, and yet, words, when carefully created in with artistry and with that special humanity that poets bring to it, they can do they can do that. They can affect that magic. They can take a person who's miserable and sad and give them a little bit of relief.
Yeah. And just um they can be like a seed of humanity. It's a way to find that through the precision of language to make those connections and overcome grief or isolation or self-doubt or so many of the things that come out in these poems. And there's so many more that I wish we could talk about. We didn't even get to the poet Rachel, who is one of my favorites and who you have some um, beautiful translations and reflections on. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I'm going to give people the um, instruction to seek those out on your own and look at them in this beautiful book. Thank you so much, Wendy, for this conversation and for sharing these poems and this book. And thanks to everybody for joining us. I always say that there is more to discover at JWA, and our Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women is chock full of learning that you can do on some of these poets who we have mentioned: Leah Goldberg, Rachel, I just mentioned at the end. We have encyclopedia articles on them. You can learn more about Israeli women writing in Hebrew from 1948 to 2004 in another article, as well as the depiction of biblical women in world and Hebrew literature. And Wendy herself has written several entries for the encyclopedia, including, this is not all of them, but I'll mention a few on Hebrew writers, including Nechama Pukachevsky, Yocheved Bat Miriam, and Anda Pinkerfeld Amir. So you can check those out. I hope that folks will join us next Thursday for a conversation with Deborah Heiligman on her book, Loudmouth, Emma Goldman versus America, a Love Story. I think we can all use a little bit of Emma Goldman in our lives these days, probably. And until next time, take care, everyone, and let's take care of each other. Good night.